Thank you very much for waiting, ladies and gentlemen. We now like to begin the WASHOKU-DO, the World Japan Cuisine Show Symposium. Washoku culture, tradition, and future. Can Washoku culture be accepted around the world is the topic. From Tokyo Kasei University, we have Professor Ayako Ehara. We have Mr. Jean Robert Pitte, member of the Institut of France, president of the French Mission of Food Heritage and Cultures. The topic is Washoku culture, tradition, and future. And can Washoku culture be accepted around the world? The moderator is Mr. Yoshiki Tsuji, chairman and head of the board of directors, Mr. Tsuji Culinary Institute. Professor Ehara, Mr. Pitte, and Mr. Tsuji, you have the floor.
Exactly what I want.
Good afternoon, everyone. Without further ado, I'd like to begin the event. I am Yoshiki Tsuji. Thank you for the introduction. Today, are you ready? Today we are going to talk about the tradition and future of Washoku culture. Can Washoku culture be accepted around the world? We have this grand theme to be discussed in a very limited amount of time of 1 hour, and we have two prominent guests to speak on this topic, Mr. John Robert Pitte and Professor Ehara. We will be asking questions to the two guests. France and Japan have two different cultures, history, tradition, and geology as well as geography. And both of them, however, have the food registered as UNESCO's intangible cultural heritage. We like to talk about the future prospect of Washoku culture and the current state. And there are three major topics we like to focus on in our discussion. First, we would like to talk about the major difference between the two foods and what we can share as a common value. And next, in the modern era, in two countries, in both of the countries, we like to discuss how those two countries have disseminated information on their food. And finally, we'd like to talk about the Japanese washoku marketing capability, whether washoku can go global and accepted around the world. So these are the things we'd like to discuss. Now I'd like to begin without further ado, and we have a question to Mr. Pitte and then to Professor Ehara, comparing France and Japan What are the major features of food in these two countries? What are the important points from geology, geography, and history? Can you share with us some important points and features and uniqueness? Starting with Mr. Pitt. What is the future of gastronomy and what are the features of geology, geography, and history? In 10 minutes, can you share with us the background as to how the French gastronomy came into being? Thank you. Dear Mr. Tsuji, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very happy. We are meeting you for the first time. However, I've known your name for over 3.5 decades. Tsuji, whenever I hear the name Tsuji in Japan, it reminds me of the France, Alexander's dish that was prepared for your father. Your father has been very instrumental in introducing important French cooks and chefs to Japan, and you also communicated the good aspects of Washoku to French chef. Has been much advancement since then. We were able to deepen our knowledge and we are able to deepen our friendship. I'd like to thank the Tsuji family. I'm very glad that I am meeting him, Yoshiki, for the first time. How you define French dish is very that's simple and easy. If you compare with Japanese and French food and Western food, in the case of France, we spend much time at the table, just like in China, and we eat anything and everything. When it comes to food, we prepare it. When it comes to gastronomy, you would present one plate after another. It's not that you provide the entire plate. Several years ago, you had one entire plate on the table, but the Russian style has developed. What we mean by Russian style? Well, actually, this is a French way of serving, one plate after the other. Salty plate, sweet plate, cold one to warm one. That's how we move. After fresh fish, you have meat and vegetables are condiments. The main dish usually is meat and fish and animal proteins serve as the main plate. In addition, the French always have bread. There are so many different types of bread with different unique features. And then one thing I came to mind as you asked me a question is that we have a very good gastronomy featured with the particular sauce. There are all different sauces being available as well. For example, since the 17th century, a variety of sauces have been discovered and presented. Extracts of fish and beef mixed with butter and cream, or you add wine, you simmer it, and you would make it a thick, dense sauce. Or emulsion, you put butter and oil. Mayonnaise is one example. You also have cold sauce, and a béarnaise is one warm sauce. So there are all different types of sauces, and that's one feature of French cuisine which distinguish French cuisine from others. Of course, the English have sauces, but it's completely different. Very acidic, less oily, neutral sauces are used in UK, but since the 17th century in France, we have rich sauce-based dishes. So in case of France or French, you have a traditional meal accompanied always with wine. Of course, nowadays it may be less the case, but my grandparents, 150 liter of wine is consumed on average, including old and young. 110 or 150 liter of wine is consumed every year. But nowadays, recently, 48 liter or 50 liter per annum is the average consumption. Perhaps I consume more, but average French seem to take much less wine consumption. Also, this answers the question. Thank you very much. Now, Professor Hara, in response to that, can you talk about history and the geographical features of the Japanese cuisine, particularly focusing on modern history, or slightly before that, perhaps? Good afternoon. It's really a great honor for me to have this discussion on this topic with Mr. Pitte at the Japan France call. When you were speaking, I was one in the audience, and I'm very happy that I have this opportunity to share the stage with you. In case of Japan, as you know, we are a peninsula, a nation surrounded by the sea. So seafood, fish, and seaweeds were abundantly harvested, and we have relatively large rainfall, leading to a good harvest of vegetable rice and particularly potatoes. In fact, in various points in the history, most of them were coming from outside. We have inbred and improved the species to reach the ingredients that we have now. That's one feature of Japanese food in terms of the ingredients, and also water is a feature. Although we have different elevations and altitudes, the soft water is what we often use. Therefore, boiling, steaming, or simmering, water-related way of cooking developed. And in relation to high-quality water, we have sake. Tofu actually came from China, and we have cold tofu. Eat it just with soy sauce, and the tofu itself is very soft and palatable. So, natural environment and influence of foreign cultures were mingled together, mixed together in Japanese cuisine. That's one feature. Mr. Pitt mentioned that the contents that are specific to Japanese food is that you have bread and you have a variety of sauces, as you mentioned. In case of Japan, you have rice. You may have different types of rice, including runs and others, and you use the cooked rice as the main staple. And this history lasted for a long time. And for soup, we use dashi coming from seaweed or bonito. And not only that, by cooking lots of vegetables, we also prepared a dashi. So soup and extracts from vegetables, the ingredients coming from a natural environment, these were combined in a special occasions. The dishes other than rice are gorgeous. They have many plates and dishes. On a day-to-day occasions, you would have less, and with these different combinations, you distinguish the special occasions and day-to-day types of food. These are some features. Thank you very much. Both countries have a unique system being developed for cuisine because of history and geography. In any case, 2 years ago, they were designated and registered as an intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO. Before Washoku was registered, I talked to Mr. Pitte. I visited him at his institute. Haute cuisine or gastronomy were what we wanted to grade Japanese food as tangible cultural heritage. And that was our proposal. Haute cuisine or gastronomy registration is not the proper way or the best way, as he advised us. It will be disadvantage for us to get our registration accepted. So if you could please explain the background as to why you said so.
Well, that's true. You visited me and talked about the plan to be listed on UNESCO. And then I recalled my experience in 2007 with my friends. I prepared to be listed again in UNESCO. And in 2006, France concluded the intangible cultural heritage, and then in the following years, we started our preparations. I am an expert of the geography, and with lots of experts, and then I have also been studied gastronomy for many years, and then the French gastronomy is well deserved to be on the list of the intangible cultural heritage, because I thought that this is really the part of the French culture. There are the conflicts on the religion or the politics in France, but once people are at the table, everybody shares the same opinions, and then the 2/3 of the people at the table are very harmonious, and then around the table everybody can agree. So the food dietary culture can be listed on UNESCO, we thought. And then the President Sarkozy, then we convinced them. He is not a gourmet type, but he is interesting. He thought that it will be interesting to think about that, because it's easy to come to a consensus about food, and that is quite unique. And so we were supported by President Sarkozy. And then we contacted UNESCO in 2007. At the end of 2007, and at the UNESCO, experts raised their both hands. Oh, gastronomy. It is a very posh and exclusive cuisine only for the elite peoples, but a cultural asset is something for the poor people. And so the typical regular plain food or the mass rituals or the traditional dances, these are the good fit for the cultural asset. There is no monument and there is no big shrines, and a country without those heritages will be listed on the cultural asset. This is what they said. So this art is for the poor countries like the country in Africa. So gastronomy doesn't have any possibility of being listed. This is what experts of UNESCO felt initially. Yeah, you may say that this is a culture, but this is rather a commercial thing. So you want to eat a foie gras or truffle or champagne, and the wonderful exclusive restaurants and gastronomy is good for tourism. That's why you are supporting this, right? It is not acceptable, I was told. So we changed our tactics. The gastronomical diet, the dietary culture of the French came up with as an idea, and then it is not the exclusive chef-prepared dishes. This is rather the dishes prepared at home, like on the occasion of Christmas or New Year's or birthdays. The dishes that will be prepared at home, prepared by themselves, by going shopping on their own, and then there are the regional traditional recipe or the homemade dishes recipes. Those are used, and then those knowledges will be passed down to their children. And then they enjoy preparation and eating them. What matters in French cuisine is that they can talk over these dishes. This is how we applied to the UNESCO list. And so Mr. Tsuji asked me about the kaiseki. Then I felt this. Yes, kaiseki is only limited for the very rich people, and then 50,000 yen kaiseki at Tokyo is not within the reach of the ordinary people. So rather than that, there should be something that can correspond and reflect the ordinary people's feeling and ideas. And then the one that is reflecting a Japanese spirit. So at the appropriate time, you can watch this now. Happy birthday.
Gather around a table to
Something happens.
gastronomic meal. For 95% of French people, this type of meal is an essential part of their shared heritage and their cultural identity. In France, the gastronomic meal is a social custom that ritualizes the pleasure of being together. Preparing a gastronomic meal means enjoying the process of choosing recipes, shopping for the best products, cooking together. Inviting friends or family over for a gastronomic meal brings into play expertise and know-how, the art of ensuring their transmission, and joy. What will we serve? How will we share in the cooking? Who will do the shopping?
Une fois que vous l'avez mis à la poissonnière à la vapeur, vous laissez refroidir la peau à votre
Et après on coupe en tranches à ce moment-là.
Qu'est-ce que tu ferais toi avec l'amandine aujourd'hui?
Poêlé.
Poêlé tout
Poêlé en
simplement.
direct. Et je pense ça.
Ça, la
When
poêlée,
shopping, people exchange knowledge, give advice, and share cooking tips. The market is a place for conversation and transmission.
Bon appétit et cuisine bien.
Merci. Allez. Je viens chercher chez vous.
The French gastronomic meal also welcomes ingredients from foreign cultures. It leads to new discoveries, helps in accepting other cultures, and encourages the appreciation of diversity.
d'olive aussi, je pense.
Ah là, vous n'inquiétez pas.
D'accord.
Voilà.
It also reflects France's regional and geographical diversity through the many different products that make their way to the table.
Un rôti de veau.
Je pense qu'on va s'orienter sur un quasi de veau.
Un quasi de veau.
Une des pièces les plus nobles. Mon propos, c'est de vous donner quelques os de veau à côté.
Ça va faire un jus onctueux avec la.
Voilà, mais surtout un jus naturel de la bête.
Oui, très très bien.
On aurait besoin de pain, s'il vous plaît.
Bonjour. Je vais composer un petit plateau qui illustre ce qui est bon en cette saison.
C'est la bonne saison dans le sens où, en ce moment, en fin de printemps, début d'été, les animaux, les vaches sont dehors, elles sont dans les pâtures. C'est plutôt la période où les pâtures sont riches et bien parfumées, donc ça donne...
Bonjour. Donc on va attaquer par l'apéritif. Les arômes de mandarine, ça c'est un bon vin pour débuter un repas.
At last, friends and family have joined together to celebrate their gastronomic meal.
Tu sais comment la meuler, mais c'est que tu sais reconnaître ta pomme de terre.
Preparation begins.
Non mais du vin blanc. C'est fait. C'est fait. Et qu'est-ce que c'est comme pomme de terre? Donc ça s'appelle la princesse amandine.
Alors, est-ce qu'on frotte le plat d'ail? Ah bah ouais quand même.
Et après, on va le couvrir d'une préparation qui sent bon, qu'on appelle un courbouillon.
Voilà.
Et après,
Pose au deux, justement parce qu'il est fragile, très très fragile.
rien ne se casse la gueule, regarde.
Allez.
Sortir sur les côtés. Je fais ça. Plier comme ça, ça va bien se plier.
Avec un glaçon. La bouteille qui est ouverte, tu mets un glaçon blanc, je serais très bien. Ça fera bien au goût.
In every family, all over France, the same ritual is observed.
Se régaler ensemble, préparer le repas ensemble, échanger, et puis à partir de là, élargir la curiosité et peut-être l'éveiller.
parents transmit to their children basic techniques and know-how. Peeling, trimming, cutting, making mayonnaise, tasting, again and again. Practice makes perfect.
Et mettre à l'intérieur.
Ça, on va faire ça. Et tu mets le jaune. Vas-y.
Tu tournes autour.
Voilà, mais voilà. Voilà, ça c'est le geste essentiel.
Tu vas les mettre là, d'accord?
Là ou là?
Là.
Tu la coupes en deux et dans une assiette, tu commences à m'épépiner parce que c'est assez long.
On prend quelques heures comme ça, des fois, pour préparer quelque chose. À la fin, on se dit, ouais, c'est moi qui ai fait ça. Voilà.
Faire plein de desserts, pour faire plaisir à ma famille, pour faire plaisir aux gens.
Of course, a gastronomic meal is not only about eating. It is a highly ritualized affair. Setting the table follows very strict rules. Children are taught how to fold napkins, where to place different kinds of glasses, and how to arrange the cutlery for the different services. Everything is ready. The cheeses are arranged on a platter and the wines are opened. The finest wines are carefully decanted. The French-style gastronomic meal is based on a sequence of services or courses. Apéritif, first course or hors d'oeuvre, fish course, meat course, cheese course, and dessert. The ritual begins with the apéritif, or appetizer, to open the appetite.
Au plaisir d'être ensemble et de se revoir.
De bien bouffer, de bien boire.
Au plaisir de la bouche.
Voilà. Les calamators, c'est des calamators.
Ça doit être bon.
Each course is brought out separately and placed in the center of the table, like an offering. It is also a conversation piece.
Un velouté avec les du persil.
Bon. Est-ce que tu mets de la cannelle?
Ouais, je sais pas, je vais goûter.
Et avec un petit peu de cerfeuil, ça peut faire un velouté d'excellent.
Ça, c'est facile.
Merci.
Il arrive.
Bon appétit. Non, vous ne commencez rien. Il y a une petite tombée de persil.
As a symbol of sharing, the whole fish and the roast are ceremoniously presented and carved at the table.
Non. Après, ça a été après. Ça, c'est les années 70.
Bon appétit. Bon appétit.
Très bon. Délicieux.
Ah bah tant mieux.
Oh là là. On ne sait pas où tu vas chercher tout ça. Mais... Très bon. Moi non plus.
As if with reverence, all conversation stops in the shared pleasure of the moment.
Dans la sauce, c'est les champignons qui sont là. Hein?
Ouais, un petit peu d'ail là.
Oui.
And to ensure a harmony of flavors, a different wine is proposed with each dish. Cheeses of various types and shapes are arranged on the cheese platter in a specific order. Each one is cut in a particular way to ensure that everyone will have an equal amount of rind and center. They are tasted beginning with the mildest and ending with the strongest. More than for everyday meals, desserts and sweets are always a part of a gastronomic meal. It's the pleasure of being together.
Mohamed, je m'occupe de mon neveu qui est à ma droite.
Sa première vocation dans la vie, c'est...
C'est bon?
A digestive liqueur or brandy ends the ritual as conversation continues around the table. I think it's good to try to preserve the art of living, of well-being, of knowing how to eat. This really is a cultural phenomenon, a part of French culture, something that's been handed down generation after generation. Submitting it to UNESCO illustrates a certain determination to maintain its transmission and to orchestrate it a little more, because I'm afraid that in the years to come, we won't be able to do that by ourselves anymore. I think a UNESCO nomination like this is very important, not only for France, but for Europe, for the whole world. Yes, it's definitely part of our culture, of our heritage. It's a living heritage, an evolving heritage. So if UNESCO recognizes that, it's really a good idea. 99% of French people hope to preserve their gastronomic meal and transmit it to future generations.
Thank you very much. It was a bit long. And watching that video, the gastronomy, which we call, is a bit different. I think the gastronomy, in its original meaning as a Greek, it is the rule or the study about the the gastric, and then the related culture. So I think the definition seems to be slightly changing. In the case of Japan, kaiseki is at the top of the cultural hierarchy, and at first we tried to list everything, including that, with the kaiseki at the top. But we redefined the gastronomy, the word, and then we switched our concept to washoku. And then how should it be listed, and how actually was it listed? Professor Ehara, can you explain that? Yes. As Mr. Tsuji mentioned, up to the third subcommittee meeting, the kaiseki and then the unique traditional dietary, the cuisines, was the target that we wanted to have it listed. But after hearing Mr. Pitte, we broadened our perspective or horizons. Not only the special cuisines on special occasions, rather we needed to list the Japanese dietary culture in its entirety. So washoku, that the traditional dietary culture, came into being, and at the end, with an example of a New Year's Day's preparation. So it means that, okay, washoku, as we define, could mean many things. How about this and how about that? But washoku is not specifying any one dish. It is a kind of a symbolic word. And then that is the dietary culture, the traditional one we have heard for many years. The traditionally dietary culture of Japan, that was especially focusing on the reverence or respect for nature. And reverence for nature, respect for nature could mean many things, but in the document for the application, there are certain wordings and sentences were used. If I summarize it, for one thing, we can get a variety of food ingredients from nature, and we utilized them in many ways. And also, these naturally obtained ingredients are used in a sustainable way in the form of the processing food and then others, so that we can maximize them without wasting them at all. We use every bit of these naturally obtained ingredients. That was an important element, and also the dishes prepared for the special occasions and also those events or rituals. Most of them are the events to respect nature, so we are thankful for those bountiness of the nature and through these rituals. So these events or rituals and related specially prepared meals, those are an important part as a kind of a special food for Japan, because people shares the time and space together with God in eating those specially prepared food. And then that occasion is the time of pleasure among families and relatives and local people in the communities. This was an important way for the Japanese to increase and strengthen the bonding among the people. Okay. So, if I summarize you, both in Japan and France may have a lot of commonalities between the two. And then let me more focus on the cuisines and the cooking. France is without a doubt an authority of the culture and heir of the culinary culture in the Western Europe. But looking at Japan, Japan is Far East and then even beyond the Chinese continent. But Japan was assimilated well to those cultures from early on, and then eventually Japan became a front runner of the Asian culture. And I heard that Dr. Pitte may have something to say against this idea. Can you explain the difference of the structure between French cuisine and the Japanese cuisines? And then in the Western Europe, why was France so successful in spreading French cuisine to around the world? Well, the dishes in my country are registered on the list of UNESCO, and it has its own history. Japan is an island country and detached from the continent, and then Japan had never been conquered by other countries. And so Japan was able to pick and choose whatever seems to be interesting from China or other countries in Asia. And then Japanese people arranged it to adapt them. That is how the Japanese history was developed. Up until Meiji period, there was not so much export of Japanese culture to other countries, and then this was the case up to Showa period. But in the past 30 years or so, very rapidly, the things Japanese have been exposed to beyond Japan, the culture and the dishes and culinaries, the cook and the chefs have gathered to Kyoto, visited Japan, and have so much influence from them. But in France is at the center of Europe. And in France, it has conquered many areas. From the central part of Paris, there was the Bourbon dynasty's cuisines, and also in the medieval era to Renaissance and the Louis XIV, the problem for them was how to organize a country. And in order to control the country, the French culture had to have some central dominance. And then Louis XIV was very artistic, showing a strong cultural power of France that was magnificent to the remaining areas, surrounding areas. And then the Louis XIV devised a new way of cuisines, and that spread it nationwide. And he wanted to expand the country to Italy, Spain, and Germany. So this Paris model of culture spread throughout Europe in the 18th century in Europe. It was so much influenced by France, as you may know. In the 18th and the 19th century, all of the elite people in Europe was very fluent in French. Everybody spoke French. And even today, the Tsar of Russia, during the First World War, and before the October Revolution in 1915, spoke in French. with their family members. And the Italian monarch, the same up until the end of the Second World War. They talked in French. So French is the word of culture, and the same can be said for the cuisines. With the strong monarchies in Europe hired the chef who were French, and the Frederick also hired the chef who are French. And then these chefs passed away in the Holland, and then the king of the Persian devised a poem to respect these chefs. This is indicative of how prestigious the French chefs were. And after Meiji era, the French cuisines were served, and even today, the French cuisine and French wine are served in the court in Japan in the public, the official functions in the imperial families. Some would not like this idea, but I think this is a part of the history, and I feel it is an honor thing that the French cuisine is used in the imperial families. And then I hope that the imperial families, I would like to say thank you to them that the French wine and French cuisines were served.
De réciprocité.
And sometimes we hope that Japanese food can be presented at a French guest visiting France. And so the French food did have a much impact. And there was a strong commitment to propagate to the rest of the world. I think we now have diversions in case of Japan after Meiji Restoration in the history of modernization. How did the food culture change structurally in Japan? When it comes to Japanese cuisine, in contrast to France, in around 1700 to sometimes after 1800, the washoku that we currently see, more like kaiseki, spread out much more as people become more and more interested to study it. We have more recipes and cookbooks and restaurants to serve it. But now in Meiji, there was a trend to incorporate something Western. This was an all-out effort, including the government. So people tend to look at Western food. And the first cookbook to be published is the translation of Western books, focusing on Western recipes. And there was much less publication of books, the cookbooks on Japanese food. And towards the end of the 1800s, in Meiji to slightly before 1900, people started to consider this to be a risk that the Japanese cuisine, including kaiseki for special occasions and special events, seemed to lose importance, and therefore people considered that to be unfortunate, and much efforts have been made to ameliorate the situation. There was a trend to improve Japanese food. As we have much impact from the West, there was also a trend to incorporate the Western medicine, which later on developed to nutritional science. And public health related study also was incorporated to make some changes in the Japanese cuisine. However, the rice-centered dishes, including main dish and soup, this format remained unchanged, but the contents, where the emphasis is put, how you strike a balance, these have been much changing. So I think there was a point in time with the stagnation. Yes. There was a trend to accept wholeheartedly the Western culture, and there was a point of stagnation in Japanese cuisine. As we look back, what do you think was an excess in terms of incorporating Western culture and Western food? What was the focus? Was that the book? Or is it the nutritional factors? The Japanese taste and the taste of the food, how you enjoy it, how you deal with ingredients, the techniques and skills, I think. I see, thank you. In modern Japan, how do you communicate Japanese food to the rest of the world is the next topic we'd like to discuss. Mr. Pitte mentioned that France, as a part of its growth strategy, always commit itself to communicate what they have as something French to communicate the rest of the world. But why is it that here in Japan we are not marketing well? Is that the lack of strategy? We cannot say that there was no strategy. Sometimes modesty is considered as a virtue in the Japanese culture. You do not publicize too much what you have as something excellent. For example, we learn soy sauce and miso from China. And in the 19th century, we exported soy sauce to Europe. When it comes to bowls and other containers, imari or satsuma potteries, they were exported to Europe through the Netherlands, the Dutch, in the 19th century. Well, satsuma started to be exported after Meiji, but in any case, it's not that we had no history of exporting food culture outside, but it wasn't something more comprehensive, and that may be the reason why we didn't get much attention. Mr. Pitt, when you communicate French cuisine to the rest of the world, what is it that you would emphasize? What was the intention then of the people there? Well, to a certain degree, we cannot deny the idea of imperialism to put Europe under its control, like during the era of Louis XIV, where Napoleon or Napoleon III, they used force to put the entire Europe under its control. However, the culture is already there. You have the language, as I mentioned, and literature. And this may be secondary, but what follows the language is the gastronomy. The French cuisine was a part of that strategy. Europe as a whole did not consider this as an obligation, but they, I think, welcomed it and accepted it. They abandoned some tradition, and in its replacement, they have embraced a noble cuisine. In the 18th century, they accepted the cuisine started in Versailles. So there was some political intention. We had the crusade, and there's a trend to always be outward looking. But in case of Japan, perhaps because you are an island nation and you had the seclusion policy by Tokugawa shogunate government, So I think you try to strengthen internally the model that you have, and of course you incorporated an influence from overseas like miso, shoyu, and rice. Much come from China and from Korean Peninsula. However, the important thing is that in Japan, you intensified, strengthen your own model internally in the country, and you were not very successful in communicating that outside except for the imperial ruling. But now with the spread of mass media, of course you have Japanese aesthetic hobbies and Japonism impacting Western art. And that I think was a cultural intention to market Japan overseas, but that was exception. After 1960, we have Mr. Tsuji with us, like people from Tsuji Culinary Institute. You invited the French chef to Japan, and those people were amazed by Japanese cuisine. Mr. Alain Ducasse was talking in the morning. He talked about the very subtleness, the motions they take, how you choose the ingredients, how you select the fresh ingredients specific to certain seasons. The French chef learned and discovered that with the surprise and praised it. It's like manga or Japanese fashion. Yoji Yamamoto, Kenzo Takada, Miss Ikse Miyake, these designers went outside of the country, like architect Tadao Ando. They go overseas, they work overseas, and the world were impressed with the Japanese culture as they discovered them. Until the 70s, Japan seems to be inward-looking or self-contained in the nation. And now question to Mr. Pitte. In the last 60 years, French cuisine is well-rooted outside of France. Currently, you don't have a French cuisine as it is as a definition. I think you're already away. The French cuisine outside of France is already away from France. So, in terms of the framework of so-called gastronomy, you come up with many things new and innovative, but you usually have French cuisine as a reference when you discuss Western food. The question to Professor Ehara is that, as an extension to that, can washoku serve as a reference to be accepted in the world? Perhaps the way it goes will be different from what we see in French cuisine now. We have the washoku specific techniques and skills. Sashimi looks simple, but how before you cut the pieces, you also need to use seaweed to coat it or impregnate it. You have different seasonings. I'm sure these are something that could be well accepted in the rest of the world. You can communicate whatever a feature washoku has, which I think is useful to the person who receives it. And there are people who are quite eager to learn washoku, including its culture, and there will be more and more such people under those circumstances as we may be doing now. We would like to let those who are interested to actually experience washoku, including culture, and that I think will be a good way to spread this. Mr. Pitte? As Professor Ehara mentioned, the the French, authentic French dishes as it is have extinguished, so to speak. The haute cuisine and haute cuisine is a fusion between Japan and France, and you have 20 plates with the Kasei French. Mr. Akram in the next room, he doesn't have a menu. He invites guests, please enjoy what I serve. That's the way it goes. It's like Mr. Murata at Kikunoi. You prepare 20 different plates and dishes, the best ones you find in the market. The ingredients are selected for a particular day from the particular market. Mr. Akram serves the French kaiseki. So the current food they serve is the fusion between Japan and France. It's difficult to draw a line between what is French and what is not French, and you are not very specific into setting a framework. That's my impression. Sometimes the overseas dish that is beyond control by French, I think, is more widespread. So, Professor Ehara, what is the framework of the Japanese cuisine? What is the essential features of the washoku? Can we just export them? And can we draw a line to say, this is washoku, this is not washoku? I think you don't need to have any definition like that. That's right. When we embrace things from overseas, it was like this. If it suits your country, then you can adjust it and assimilate it to your own culture. That is the way we did the Japanese skills and Japanese techniques of cooking when they are exported to overseas. How they are embraced and accepted by each country depends on the culture of that specific nation. I think that's common, and that may turn out to be something completely different from washoku that we have here, but something unexpected might be created out of that.
What do you think about this, Mr. Pitte? I agree with her, but there is some risk associated with it, and that's the last thing I want to talk about. That is a fusion. And then you come not to understand what your own culture is after all the cultures are mingled and mixed up. And then that phenomenon has happened in the film or other cultures. But there is an important thing in the cuisines. In Japan, in France, the locally produced the ingredients that it has taken root in that particular rural area, and then that is produced at this particular place at a particular time of the year. Those ingredients have to be cherished and to keep the diversity of the culinary cultures. The culture requires diversity in spite of the globalizations. Not all the cultures should be mingled together and blended together. Of course, the exchange is necessary, but diversity is also important in cuisines and cooking. That the local the dishes are important. When these go beyond the country, and that will be arranged to fit the local the atmosphere and culture. But I think that's good, but it is bad to cause the confusion even in Japan. So what is the fundamental elements of Japanese cuisines? That is something we have nurtured and then inherited from the past, which is very important and with lots of values. So that has to be passed down to the next generations. But the way it is cooked and it is seasoned will be a little bit different according to the time. But the basic things should be the same, and we have to keep learning about that for years to come. So that is what Japan should communicate beyond the nation. And then Mr. Pitte said that the dietary culture that Japan has, yes, the locality and the local ingredient and the skills, this is something that have to be widely spread and introduced beyond Japan. Is that right? Okay. Time flies. But we could keep talking about these things beyond here. But France is a big agricultural country, and Japan has such a strong cultural power and skills. How can we spread this? Just rather than looking back the history, we need to come up with some new ways, a new method to communicate Japanese culture in the way that is unique to Japan. And then on that aspect, education matters most. The Japanese cuisines by Japanese people. We need to train and educate Japanese students to learn them. And also we should invite non-Japanese from overseas who are willing to learn. And then when you want to learn wine, you visit Bourgogne and other places in France. But how many of non-Japanese are willing to go to Risili Island in Hokkaido to learn about the kelp? So this is the process of accumulations and day-by-day effort. I just forcibly summarized these discussions, but thank you very much for taking time joining us today.